Day 1, Matthew Turner got lost. Day 2, his headlamp died. Day 3, he started hallucinating. Day 4, he forgot his own name. This is how an experienced caver lost his mind in 4 days of endless darkness. Welcome to Cave Stories, where we examine real cave accidents and the critical mistakes that turned adventure into a 4-day nightmare of starvation, dehydration, and madness. Matthew Turner wasn't a beginner. The 32-year-old software developer from Albuquerque had explored over 80 caves solo in 5 years. But on March 11th, 2020, he entered Labyrinth Cave in New Mexico, and within 2 hours, he was hopelessly lost in a maze of identical passages that all looked exactly the same, and things were about to get much, much worse. Matthew had discovered solo caving 3 years after a brutal breakup with his girlfriend Rachel. He'd needed something to fill the emptiness, something that challenged him, something he could do alone without depending on anyone else. Caving became his therapy, his meditation, his escape from the world above. Every weekend he'd drive to a different cave system, spend hours underground exploring passages and chambers, then emerge feeling cleansed and centered. His friends thought it was weird and dangerous. His family worried constantly, but Matthew didn't care. Solo caving made him feel alive in a way nothing else did. But here's the critical thing about Matthew's approach to caving. He'd developed some very bad habits. He rarely told anyone where he was going. He often skipped the detailed trip plans that experienced cavers are supposed to file. He pushed his limits regularly, going deeper and staying longer than was safe. And he'd gotten away with it for 5 years, which made him believe he was invincible. This was caving mistake number 1, and it created the conditions for everything that followed. On March 10th, 2020, Matthew was browsing caving forums when he came across a discussion about Labyrinth Cave, a system in southern New Mexico that lived up to its name. The cave was a 3-dimensional maze of passages that twisted and turned and doubled back on themselves in confusing patterns. It had been partially mapped, but large sections remained unexplored because the cave was so disorienting that even experienced cavers got turned around. Most people who visited Labyrinth Cave did so in groups of 4 or more, using extensive marking systems and staying in the mapped sections. But Matthew read the warnings and saw a challenge, not a deterrent. He spent that evening researching Labyrinth Cave. He found the partial maps online, read trip reports from other cavers, and studied the cave's reputation. Everyone agreed it was confusing. Everyone agreed you needed a group and good navigation skills. Everyone agreed you should mark your route extensively. Matthew nodded along as he read, thinking to himself that he'd be more careful than those other people. He'd been in confusing cave systems before. He'd always found his way out. This would be no different. This confidence, this belief that his past success guaranteed future success, was caving mistake number 2. On the morning of March 11th, Matthew loaded his gear into his truck. He had his helmet with a mounted LED headlamp, his backup lights, a small backpack with minimal supplies, his phone, and a basic first aid kit. What he didn't pack was enough water, enough food, proper marking materials, or a detailed map of Labyrinth Cave. He told himself he'd only be underground for 3 or 4 hours, just a quick exploration of the entrance areas. He didn't need extensive supplies for a short trip. This inadequate preparation was caving mistake number 3. The drive to Labyrinth Cave took 2 hours. The cave was located on Bureau of Land Management property in a remote area with no cell service. The closest town was 30 miles away. As Matthew drove, he thought about whether he should text someone his plans. His ex-girlfriend Rachel had always insisted on it when they'd caved together. She'd been paranoid about safety, constantly worried about worst-case scenarios. Matthew had found it annoying at the time, but now, 3 years later, he could admit she'd had a point. He pulled out his phone to send her a text, then stopped. They hadn't spoken in 6 months. It would be weird to text her out of nowhere just to say he was going caving. He put the phone away. He'd be fine. He was always fine. This decision, this choice not to tell anyone where he was going, was caving mistake number 4, and it would nearly cost him his life. Matthew arrived at the Labyrinth Cave trailhead at 8:45 a.m. There were no other vehicles in the small dirt parking area, which wasn't surprising. This wasn't a popular tourist cave, and it was a Wednesday morning. He geared up, did a quick check of his headlamp, and started the 15-minute hike to the cave entrance. The New Mexico desert was beautiful in the morning light, all red rock and blue sky and that particular clarity of air you only get in the high desert. Matthew felt good, energized, ready for an adventure. The entrance to Labyrinth Cave was an unimpressive hole in a limestone hillside, maybe 4 feet wide and 3 feet high. A faded sign posted by the BLM warned, "Unmapped cave system, experienced cavers only, high risk of disorientation, groups of 3 or more recommended." Matthew read the sign and shrugged. He'd been in harder caves. He ducked through the entrance at exactly 9 a.m. The initial passage was a low crawl that descended at a slight angle. Matthew moved forward on his hands and knees, his headlamp illuminating smooth limestone walls. After about 50 feet, the passage opened into a small chamber, maybe 10 feet across. And from that chamber, 5 different passages led away in different directions. This was Matthew's first real look at why the cave was called Labyrinth. Every passage looked identical, same size, same slope, same limestone formations. There were no distinctive features to tell them apart. Matthew pulled out his phone and took a photo of the chamber, thinking he'd use photos to help navigate. He chose the middle passage and continued forward. That passage ran for about 100 feet, then branched into 3 more passages. Matthew took another photo and chose the left passage. That one ran 80 feet and branched into 4 passages. Matthew was starting to see the problem. This wasn't a linear cave with a main route and side passages. This was a true 3-dimensional maze where every junction looked like every other junction. But he wasn't worried yet. He was keeping track of his choices. Middle, left, right, middle. He could reverse that sequence to get back out. Easy. For the next 90 minutes, Matthew explored deeper into Labyrinth Cave. He moved through passage after passage, chamber after chamber, taking photos at major junctions and trying to remember his route. The cave was fascinating, with beautiful formations and interesting geology. He found chambers with crystal formations, passages with flowing water, and tight squeezes that tested his flexibility. He was having a great time, completely absorbed in the exploration. And that's when he realized he had no idea how to get back to the entrance. It happened suddenly, the realization of being lost. Matthew had been crawling through a narrow passage, emerged into another small chamber, and looked around at the 3 passages leading away from it. According to his mental map, he'd just come from the passage on the left. But when he turned around to look, there were actually 4 passages in this chamber, not 3. Had he miscounted? Or was this a different chamber than he thought? He pulled out his phone to check his photos, and that's when he made a horrifying discovery. His phone was at 12% battery. He'd been taking photos constantly, using the screen brightness to view his maps, and hadn't noticed how fast the battery was draining in the cold cave environment. As he watched, the battery percentage dropped to 11%. He had maybe 20 minutes of phone usage left, and then he'd be relying entirely on his headlamp. Matthew felt the first flutter of real fear in his chest. Okay, he thought. Don't panic. Think logically. He tried to review his route in his mind. He'd entered the cave at 9 a.m. It was now 11:07 a.m. according to his dying phone. He'd been underground for 2 hours and 7 minutes. He'd made approximately 40 or 50 turns. Could he remember them all in reverse order? He tried. Middle, then left, then right, then middle, then... Or was it middle, then left, then middle, then right. The sequences were blurring together in his memory. Every junction had looked the same. Every passage had looked identical. He couldn't visualize the specific features that would tell them apart. He needed a strategy. The classic solution to a maze is to always turn the same direction, right hand on the wall, and eventually you'll either find the exit or map the entire maze. Matthew decided to try this. He put his right hand on the wall and started walking, keeping contact with the rock, always taking the rightmost passage at every junction. He moved steadily for 30 minutes, his phone battery dying, his headlamp the only source of light. And then he found himself back in a chamber he recognized. There was a distinctive orange streak in the limestone that he'd definitely seen before. He'd been walking in a loop. The right-hand rule didn't work in three-dimensional mazes with multiple levels. Matthew's fear intensified. He checked the time. 11:45 a.m. He'd now been underground for 2 hours and 45 minutes. His phone died as he looked at it, the screen going black with a sad little battery icon. Now he had no camera, no map, no way to call for help even if he had signal, and no time reference except his watch. All he had was his headlamp, one backup, flashlight in his pack, and his increasingly panicked mind. He needed to think rationally. He tried to remember what he knew about being lost in caves. First rule, stay calm. Panic kills. Second rule, conserve resources. Don't waste light or energy. Third rule, if you can't find the exit, find water and shelter and wait for rescue. But that third rule assumed someone knew you were in the cave and would send rescue when you didn't emerge. Matthew had told no one where he was going. No one would even know he was missing until Monday, when he didn't show up for work. That was 4 days away. Could he survive 4 days underground with no food and minimal water? Matthew sat down in the chamber to think, and immediately noticed something he should have been monitoring all along. He was thirsty, very thirsty. He'd been exploring for almost 3 hours in dry cave air, breathing hard from physical exertion, and he'd only brought one 500-milliliter water bottle, which he'd already drunk half of. He had 250 milliliters of water left. That was enough for maybe 12 hours if he rationed it carefully. After that, he'd need to find water in the cave or face severe dehydration. The panic was really setting in now, but Matthew forced himself to breathe slowly. Panic uses oxygen and energy. Stay calm. Think clearly. He made a decision. He would continue trying to find the exit, but he would do so systematically. He would mark his route this time so he wouldn't walk in loops. He didn't have proper marking materials, but he had the bandana around his neck. He could tear it into strips and leave pieces at junctions. It wasn't much, but it was something. He tore the red bandana into 15 strips, each about 2 inches long. He'd place one strip at each junction, positioned to point back the direction he'd come from. This way, if he hit a dead end, he could follow the strips back to the last junction and try a different route. Matthew started moving again, placing strips of bandana at junctions, trying new passages, hitting dead ends, backtracking, trying again. The cave system seemed endless. Every time he thought he was making progress toward the entrance, he'd hit a passage that dead-ended or looped back on itself. The formations that had seemed beautiful and fascinating 3 hours ago now looked sinister and threatening in his headlamp beam. The shadows seemed to move. The silence was oppressive, broken only by his breathing and the occasional drip of water. By 2 p.m., Matthew had used up all 15 pieces of bandana. He'd explored what felt like miles of passage but had no idea if he was any closer to the exit. His headlamp was still strong, the LED barely draining the batteries, but that wouldn't last forever. He had maybe 10 hours of light left, probably less. His backup flashlight had 2 hours of battery life at most. After that, he'd be in total darkness. The thought made his stomach clench with fear. He came to another junction and had to make a choice without any marking material left. He chose the passage that seemed to slope upward, reasoning that the entrance had descended and therefore the exit should ascend. The passage climbed steeply for about 150 feet, then narrowed to a crawl space. Matthew squeezed through the crawl, his backpack scraping on the limestone ceiling, and emerged into a large chamber. This chamber was different from the others he'd seen. It was bigger, maybe 40 feet across, and the ceiling was covered in spectacular white formations. In the center of the chamber was a pool of crystal-clear water, maybe 6 feet in diameter. Water. Matthew felt a surge of hope. At least he wouldn't die of dehydration. He approached the pool carefully, shining his light into it. The water looked clean and clear, about 3 feet deep. He knew that drinking untreated cave water was risky, could cause all sorts of bacterial infections, but he also knew that dehydration would kill him much faster than bacteria. He filled his water bottle from the pool, said a little prayer, and drank half of it. The water was cold and tasted faintly mineral, but not bad. He refilled the bottle. At least he'd solved one problem. But the water chamber created a new problem. Was this progress, or was he going deeper into the cave? The chamber had 5 passages leading away from it, all at different angles and slopes. Matthew had no idea which one led toward the exit. He chose one at random and continued exploring. And that's when his headlamp started to dim. Not dramatically, just a slight decrease in brightness, but it was noticeable. The batteries were starting to fail. Matthew checked his watch, 3:30 p.m. He'd been underground for 6.5 hours. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't getting out today. He was going to spend the night in this cave, alone, with failing light and no food. The nightmare was just beginning. Matthew knew he needed to find a place to spend the night, somewhere relatively safe where he wouldn't accidentally roll into a crevice or wander off a ledge in the darkness. He returned to the water chamber, reasoning that at least here he had access to drinking water. The chamber floor was relatively flat, covered in a thin layer of limestone dust. It wasn't comfortable, but it would do. He sat down with his back against the wall, turned off his headlamp to conserve battery, and was immediately plunged into darkness so absolute it felt like being blind. If you've never experienced true darkness, the kind you get deep inside a cave, you can't really understand what it does to your mind. It's not like the darkness of a room at night where your eyes adjust and you can see vague shapes. This was complete, total absence of light. Matthew held his hand 6 inches from his face and saw nothing. Not a silhouette, not a shadow, absolutely nothing. The darkness was so profound it felt like a physical presence, pressing against his eyes, filling his lungs, crawling into his ears. He turned the headlamp back on immediately, his heart pounding. He couldn't do it. He couldn't sit in that darkness, but he also couldn't keep the light on all night. He needed to save the batteries for tomorrow when he'd continue searching for the exit. Matthew compromised. He turned the headlamp to its lowest setting, barely a glow, just enough to see the immediate area around him. It gave him maybe a 3-foot radius of dim light, but it was better than nothing. He estimated this setting would give him maybe 20 hours of battery life instead of 10. That meant he could keep it on through the night at low power and still have light for most of tomorrow. He pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapped his arms around them, and tried to stay warm. The cave temperature was constant at about 54 degrees Fahrenheit, not cold enough to kill you quickly, but cold enough to sap your body heat over time. He was wearing jeans and a long-sleeve shirt, adequate for active caving, but not for sitting still for hours. He was going to get very cold. The first hour wasn't so bad. Matthew's mind was still racing with adrenaline, planning strategies for tomorrow, reviewing the passages he'd already explored. trying to build a mental map of the system. But as the second hour dragged on, the cold started to really penetrate. His fingers and toes went numb first. Then his legs started to ache from the chill. He stood up and did jumping jacks, trying to generate body heat, then sat back down, exhausted. He needed to conserve energy. He'd only eaten one of his 2 protein bars, saving the other for tomorrow. His stomach was starting to cramp with hunger, but he ignored it. Hunger wouldn't kill him for weeks. Cold and dehydration were the immediate threats. The third hour was when the psychological effects really started. The silence was maddening. In normal life, there's always ambient sound, traffic, wind, other people, electronics humming, something. But in the cave, there was nothing except his own breathing and occasional drips of water. The lack of sound created a sensory deprivation effect. His mind started to fill the silence with phantom noises. He heard footsteps that weren't there. He heard voices calling his name. He heard music playing faintly in the distance. Each time his heart would leap with hope that rescue had arrived, and then he'd realize it was just his brain manufacturing stimulation in the absence of input. By the 6th hour, around 9:30 p.m., Matthew's physical discomfort had reached a level that made sleep impossible. He was shivering constantly, his muscles cramping from the cold and the hard rock beneath him. He was desperately thirsty despite drinking from the pool multiple times. Cave water doesn't just quench thirst. It seems to make it worse somehow, maybe because of the mineral content. His lips were starting to crack. His mouth felt like sandpaper, and the hunger had evolved from mild discomfort to genuine pain, his stomach producing acid that had nothing to digest, burning his empty gut. But worse than the physical discomfort was the fear. Matthew had never felt fear like this before. It was a primal, existential terror that made his chest tight and his thoughts spiral. He was going to die down here. That was the thought that kept echoing in his mind. No one knew where he was. No one would look for him for days. Even when they did start looking, how would they know to check Labyrinth Cave? He hadn't told anyone. His truck was parked at a remote trailhead that maybe got a dozen visitors per year. It could be weeks before someone found his vehicle and alerted authorities. By then, he'd be dead. His body would decompose in this water chamber, bones eventually scattering across the limestone floor, another lost caver who'd made stupid mistakes and paid the ultimate price. Matthew tried to fight these thoughts, tried to stay positive, but the darkness and the cold and the silence were relentless. Around midnight, he made a decision. He couldn't just sit here waiting to die. Tomorrow, as soon as he had enough light, he'd start a systematic search. He'd explore every passage, mark them somehow, map the system in his mind, and find the damn exit. It was a cave, not a black hole. There was a way out. He just had to find it. This determination gave him something to hold on to, a purpose that fought back against the despair. He must have dozed off sometime around 2 a.m. because he woke with a start to find his headlamp had dimmed further, the battery finally starting to fail. The dim light that had been giving him a 3-foot radius was now more like 1 foot. Panic surged through him. He'd been unconsciously draining the battery while sleeping. He turned it off immediately, plunging himself back into that oppressive, total darkness. He sat there, heart pounding, trying to control his breathing, telling himself he could turn it back on any time, that the darkness couldn't hurt him. But it felt like it could. It felt like the darkness was alive, watching him, waiting for him to break. The rest of the night was a special kind of torture. Matthew sat in complete darkness, shivering violently, his mind alternating between problem-solving and panic. He thought about Rachel, his ex-girlfriend, and wished desperately that he'd sent her that text. She would have called the authorities when he didn't respond by evening. Rescue could already be in the cave searching for him right now. But instead, no one even knew he was missing. He thought about his parents, his co-workers, his friends. Would they miss him? Would they understand that his death had been the result of stupid decisions compounded by bad luck? Or would they think he'd been reckless and gotten what he deserved? When Matthew finally turned his headlamp back on to check his watch, it was 6:15 a.m. He'd survived the first night, but just barely. His body was cramping from the cold and the hardness of the rock floor. His throat was raw and painful. His stomach was a knot of hunger pain. But he was alive, and he had light, and that meant he could continue searching. He drank deeply from the water pool, eating some of the moss that grew around its edges. The moss tasted horrible, bitter and slimy, but it was organic matter and his body needed something. He gagged it down, then ate his second and final protein bar. That was it. He had no food left. From this point on, he'd be living on water and whatever else he could find in the cave. Matthew stood up, his legs shaky and unreliable, and started exploring again. This was day 2, March 12th, though he didn't know what time it was on the surface. His watch showed 6:45 a.m., but that was cave time, meaningless without connection to the outside world. He chose a passage he hadn't explored yet and moved forward with renewed determination. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes opening into chambers, sometimes narrowing to crawls. Matthew marked his route by scraping arrows into the limestone dust on the floor with a rock. It wasn't permanent, but it was better than nothing. After 2 hours of exploring, Matthew's headlamp suddenly flickered. Then it flickered again. Then it went dim, very dim, barely a candle's worth of light. The battery was dying. Terror shot through him. He fumbled in his backpack for his backup flashlight, pulled it out with shaking hands, and turned it on. The flashlight beam was strong and bright, a blessed relief. But he knew this flashlight had maybe 2 hours of battery life. After that, he'd be in darkness. Permanent darkness. The thought made him want to scream. He had to find the exit now. Not tomorrow, not later today, but right now. He moved faster, taking risks, squeezing through tight passages without carefully assessing them first, choosing routes randomly rather than systematically. This was caving mistake number 5, letting panic override rational decision-making. When you're lost, speed is not your friend. Methodical, systematic search is what saves you. But Matthew's mind was fracturing under the stress, and rationality was slipping away. At 10:30 a.m. on day 2, Matthew's backup flashlight died. One moment he had light, the next moment he was plunged into absolute, complete darkness. He stood frozen in the middle of a passage, not daring to move, not even sure which direction he was facing. The darkness was so total that he experienced true sensory deprivation for the first time. Within minutes, he started hallucinating. He saw lights that weren't there, floating orbs of color drifting through his field of vision. His brain, desperate for visual input, was manufacturing it. He heard voices again, louder now, more insistent. Someone calling his name. "Matthew! Matthew, where are you?" he called back. "Help! I'm here! I'm right here!" But the voices didn't respond. They weren't real. Matthew sat down right where he was, not daring to walk blind through passages he couldn't see. He could feel the rock walls on either side of him, close enough to touch. The passage was maybe 3 feet wide. He'd wait here. He'd wait until what? Until rescue? But no one was coming. Until he died? That seemed more likely. He felt tears running down his face, hot against his cold skin. He was 32 years old, and he was going to die alone in the darkness, and it was entirely his own fault. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. Matthew's watch had a luminous dial, and he could see it if he held it right up to his face, but the numbers stopped mattering. 11 a.m., 2 p.m., 5 p.m. What difference did it make? He was stuck in eternal night. He drank from his water bottle, which he'd filled at the pool. He'd had the presence of mind to fill it before his last light source died, at least. So he had water. He could survive on water for weeks, theoretically. But could he survive weeks in darkness? Could his mind handle it? The answer, he was discovering, was no. By day 3, March 13th, Matthew's grasp on reality was deteriorating rapidly. The hallucinations were constant now. He saw entire rooms appearing in the darkness, lit rooms with furniture and people, his childhood bedroom, his office at work, Rachel's apartment. He'd reach out to touch them and his hand would meet solid rock, and the vision would dissolve. He heard full conversations happening around him, people discussing things, laughing, arguing. Sometimes he joined in, talking to people who weren't there, carrying on dialogues with hallucinations. The worst hallucination started around noon on day 3. Matthew saw his younger brother Danny standing in front of him, illuminated by a soft golden light. Danny had died in a car accident 5 years earlier, but here he was, looking exactly as he had at age 24, smiling that familiar smile. "Hey, Matt," Danny said. "You look like shit." Matthew reached out, knowing it wasn't real, but needing desperately for it to be real. "Danny, is that really you?" Danny nodded. "It's me. I'm here to help you. I know the way out. Come on, follow me." And Danny started walking, that golden light moving with him through the darkness. Matthew followed. He walked through passages he couldn't see, following a dead brother who wasn't there, navigating by feel and by the hallucinated light. He talked to Danny as he walked. "Do you remember the time we went camping in Colorado? Do you remember when Dad taught us to fish? Do you forgive me for not being there when you died?" Danny answered all his questions, reassuring him, guiding him, promising that the exit was just ahead, just around the next corner, just a little further. This continued for hours. Matthew walked and crawled and climbed, following his hallucination deeper and deeper into Labyrinth Cave. He had no idea if he was going toward the exit or away from it. He had no idea if he was even moving in a consistent direction or just wandering in circles. All he knew was that Danny was with him, and Danny wouldn't let him die. Big brothers protect little brothers. That's how it works. Except Danny was the little brother, and Danny was dead. And this was all in Matthew's fracturing mind. At some point, Matthew fell. He was crawling through a low passage, following Danny's light, when the floor suddenly dropped away. He tumbled down a slope, maybe 10 or 12 feet, landing hard on his left side. Pain exploded through his ribs and shoulder. He lay there in the darkness, gasping, tasting blood in his mouth. He'd bitten his tongue in the fall. Danny's light was gone. Matthew called out for him. "Danny! Danny, come back! I need you!" But Danny didn't respond. The hallucination had finally broken. Matthew was alone again in the absolute darkness, now injured and disoriented, with no idea where he was or how to get back to the water chamber. Day 4 began with Matthew not knowing it was day 4. He'd lost track of time completely. His watch was still on his wrist, but he'd stopped checking it because the numbers meant nothing. Morning, afternoon, night, they were all the same in the endless darkness. He lay where he'd fallen, his ribs screaming with pain every time he breathed. His shoulder either dislocated or badly bruised, he couldn't tell which, and somewhere in the fog of his deteriorating mind, he'd stopped caring about finding the exit. He just wanted the pain and the fear to stop. Matthew's thoughts had become fragmented and strange. He'd catch himself in the middle of conversations with people who weren't there, not even realizing he was talking out loud until he heard his own voice echoing in the darkness. He'd forget where he was for minutes at a time, thinking he was in his apartment, in his office, in his truck. Then reality would crash back and he'd remember, trapped, alone, dying in a cave whose name he could no longer recall. What was the name? Labyrinth? Maze Cave? Mystery Cave? The words slipped away from him like water through his fingers. He was desperately thirsty, but had no idea where the water pool was. He'd left it to follow Danny, and now he couldn't find his way back. He tried to retrace his route by feel, crawling through passages in the darkness, but every passage felt the same. Smooth limestone under his hands, cold air against his face, the smell of damp rock and earth. He found water eventually, not the pool, but a tiny trickle running down a wall. He pressed his mouth against the wet limestone and sucked at the moisture like a dying man, which, he supposed, he was. Food was a distant memory. Matthew had moved beyond hunger into a strange state where his stomach had stopped hurting and instead felt hollow and numb. His body was consuming itself, burning muscle and fat for energy. He'd lost probably 15 or 20 pounds in 4 days. His jeans hung loose on his hips. His face was gaunt, though he couldn't see it in the darkness. He could feel it when he touched his cheeks, the bones more prominent, the skin stretched tight. He was becoming a skeleton, slowly but inevitably. But the physical deterioration was nothing compared to what was happening to his mind. On what was actually the morning of Day 4, March 14th, Matthew experienced a complete break from reality. He forgot his own name. He knew he was a person, knew he existed, but when he tried to think of what to call himself, there was nothing. Just empty space where his identity should have been. He spent what might have been hours trying to remember. It started with M. Or did it? Mark? Mike? Martin? None of them felt right. The panic of not knowing who you are is profound and primal. Your name is fundamental to your sense of self. Without it, you're untethered, floating in darkness both literal and metaphorical. Matthew, or the thing that had been Matthew, started moving again. Not with any purpose or direction, just animal movement, crawling through passages because staying still felt like giving up, and some deep part of his brain refused to give up. He crawled through the darkness, his hands and knees bleeding from the rough limestone, his injured ribs grinding with every movement. He was making sounds, he realized, low moaning sounds that weren't quite words. His throat was so raw that even these sounds hurt, but he couldn't stop making them. The sounds were proof he still existed. At some point, he found himself in a large chamber. He could tell it was large by the way his sounds echoed differently, the reverberations coming back from further away. He stood up, swaying, and walked forward with his arms outstretched like a blind man. 3 steps, 4 steps, 5. And then his foot hit something that moved. He stumbled, fell to his knees, and reached down to touch it. It was a backpack. Someone else's backpack, old and rotted. His fingers explored it, finding the zipper, opening it. Inside were crumbling remains, a water bottle, empty and cracked, a flashlight that didn't work when he clicked it, and bones, small bones, delicate, probably from someone's hand. Someone else had died in this cave. He wasn't the first. He wouldn't be the last. Instead of terrifying him, this discovery brought a strange sense of peace. He wasn't alone. Someone else had walked this path before him. He lay down next to the backpack, next to the bones, and closed his eyes. In the darkness, closing your eyes makes no difference, but the gesture felt important. He was ready. He'd fought as hard as he could, survived as long as he could, and now he was ready to stop. His breathing slowed, his heart rate dropped. Hypothermia and dehydration and starvation were all working together to shut his body down. He drifted into unconsciousness, expecting never to wake up. But Matthew didn't die on the floor of that chamber because 200 feet above him, on the surface, Rachel Kim had finally decided to call the police. Rachel was Matthew's ex-girlfriend, the one he'd almost texted before entering the cave. They'd broken up 3 years ago, but they'd remained on speaking terms, checking in with each other every few months. On March 13th, 3 days after Matthew had entered Labyrinth Cave, Rachel had sent him a text. "Hey, hope you're doing okay. Want to grab coffee sometime?" When Matthew didn't respond by the next morning, Rachel wasn't worried. Matthew sometimes took a day to respond to messages, but when March 14th passed with no response and then March 15th morning came with still nothing, Rachel's concern grew. She called Matthew's phone, straight to voicemail, which meant either it was off or dead. She called his work. He hadn't shown up Monday, hadn't called in sick, which was completely unlike him. His boss was annoyed and worried in equal measure. Rachel called Matthew's parents, who lived in Texas. They hadn't heard from him in a week, but that was normal. Matthew was independent, often went days without contact, but when Rachel explained that he'd missed work without calling, his mother's voice went tight with fear. She asked Rachel to call the police. Rachel drove to Matthew's apartment, let herself in with the spare key he'd given her years ago, and never asked for back. His bed was made. His laptop was on the kitchen table. His truck was gone. She called the Albuquerque Police Department and filed a missing person report. The officer who took the report asked the standard questions. Any history of mental illness? Drug use? Suicidal ideation? Rachel answered no to all of them, but mentioned that Matthew was an avid solo caver. The officer's expression changed. Solo caver. That's high risk. Does he tell people where he's going? Rachel's heart sank. Number. He doesn't. The police took it seriously. A missing person who's a solo caver could be anywhere in dozens of cave systems across New Mexico. They put out alerts, contacted the National Speleological Society's Cave Rescue Commission, and started checking known cave entrances. Sheriff Tom Bradley of Luna County was assigned to coordinate the search. Tom had been involved in 3 cave rescues over his 30-year career. 2 had ended with successful extractions. 1 had ended with body recovery. He knew the statistics. The longer someone is missing in a cave, the less likely they are to survive. Tom and his team started with the most popular caves near Albuquerque, the ones with parking areas and established trails. They found no sign of Matthew's truck at any of them. On March 15th, 4 days after Matthew had entered Labyrinth Cave, a ranger doing a routine patrol of BLM land reported a lone vehicle at the Labyrinth Cave trailhead. The truck had been there for several days, based on the dust accumulation and the fact that the ranger remembered the spot being empty on his previous patrol 3 days ago. They ran the plates. It was Matthew Turner's truck. Sheriff Tom Bradley assembled a cave rescue team immediately. Labyrinth Cave's reputation was well known among local cavers. If Matthew had gone in there alone and gotten lost, he was in serious trouble. The rescue team consisted of 8 experienced cave rescue specialists, including Dr. Alan Foster, who had 20 years of cave rescue experience. They brought sophisticated equipment, powerful LED lighting systems, rope rescue gear, medical supplies, portable radios that could work through rock using extremely low-frequency transmission, and most importantly, 3 search and rescue dogs trained in cave work. The team entered Labyrinth Cave at 2 p.m. on March 15th. The dogs, specially trained to track human scent even in the confusing air currents of cave systems, immediately picked up Matthew's trail. They followed it through the entrance passages into the branching maze, making choices at junctions that seemed random but were actually based on scent concentrations. The rescue team marked their route extensively with glow sticks and reflective tape, ensuring they could find their way back out. They called Matthew's name constantly, their shouts echoing through the limestone passages. After 2 hours of searching, one of the dogs, a German shepherd named Ranger, became extremely agitated at a particular junction. He barked and pawed at the floor, then bolted down a narrow passage. His handler, Maria Santos, followed quickly, trusting the dog's instincts. The passage descended steeply, requiring careful climbing. At the bottom of the descent was the large chamber where Matthew lay unconscious next to the decades-old backpack and bones. Maria swept her powerful LED light across the chamber and saw him. "Oh, God, we've got him!" she shouted into her radio. "Subject located. He's down. We need medical." Dr. Foster arrived within minutes, sliding down the descent passage with practiced ease. He knelt beside Matthew and immediately began assessment. Matthew was alive, barely. His pulse was weak and thready, maybe 45 beats per minute. His breathing was shallow and irregular. His core body temperature, measured with a portable thermometer, was 91 degrees Fahrenheit, moderate hypothermia. He was severely dehydrated, his lips cracked and bleeding, his skin cool and clammy. He had obvious injuries: bruised or broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, multiple abrasions and contusions, but most concerning were his neurological signs. When Dr. Foster shone a light in Matthew's eyes, the pupils reacted but slowly, suggesting possible brain injury from the extended hypoxia and dehydration. "Matthew, can you hear me?" Dr. Foster spoke loudly, clearly. Matthew's eyes fluttered but didn't open. "Matthew Turner, you're safe. We're rescue. We're getting you out." No response. Dr. Foster started treatment immediately. He inserted an IV line into Matthew's arm, a difficult task with collapsed veins, and began pushing warm saline solution to combat the dehydration and hypothermia. He wrapped Matthew in emergency thermal blankets. He immobilized the injured shoulder and placed an oxygen mask over Matthew's face, pushing pure oxygen to help his depleted system. The extraction from Labyrinth Cave took 4 agonizing hours. The rescue team had to carry Matthew through the maze of passages, navigating tight crawls and vertical climbs while keeping him immobilized and continuing medical treatment. They moved as quickly as safety allowed, knowing that Matthew's condition was critical and every minute mattered. At 8:30 p.m. on March 15th, the rescue team emerged from Labyrinth Cave. An ambulance was waiting, lights flashing in the darkness. Matthew's parents had driven up from Texas and were there, his mother crying when she saw the stretcher being carried out, his father's face set in grim lines. Matthew was rushed to University of New Mexico Hospital in Albuquerque, the nearest trauma center with the resources to handle his condition. In the emergency room, a full trauma team descended on him. They established additional IV lines, drew extensive blood work, and began rapid rewarming protocols. The lab results were alarming: severe dehydration with elevated sodium and blood urea nitrogen levels indicating kidney stress. His glucose was dangerously low at 45 milligrams per deciliter, his body having consumed all available energy stores. His white blood cell count was elevated, suggesting infection from the untreated water he'd drunk. But most concerning were the signs of rhabdomyolysis, a condition where muscle tissue breaks down and releases proteins into the bloodstream that can damage the kidneys. The 4 days of extreme stress had literally caused Matthew's body to start consuming itself. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma, was called to consult. When Matthew finally regained consciousness on March 16th, more than 24 hours after being extracted from the cave, his first words were nonsensical. He asked where Danny was. He couldn't remember his own name when asked. He became agitated when nurses tried to give him medication, thinking they were trying to poison him. Dr. Warren recognized these as signs of severe psychological trauma combined with possible organic brain injury from the extended period of oxygen deprivation and dehydration. Matthew spent 11 days in the hospital. His physical injuries healed relatively quickly. The dislocated shoulder was reduced and immobilized. The broken ribs were taped. The dehydration was corrected with IV fluids. The kidney stress resolved as his body recovered. But the psychological damage was profound and terrifying. Matthew had experienced what psychiatrists call extreme dissociation, a condition where the mind literally breaks from reality to protect itself from unbearable trauma. He'd lost his sense of identity, hallucinated for days, and experienced what could only be described as temporary psychosis. Even after his cognitive functions began to return, Matthew's memory of the 4 days in the cave was fragmented and confused. He remembered entering Labyrinth Cave. He remembered getting lost. But then his memories became kaleidoscopic and unreliable. Walking with his dead brother, finding bones, drinking from walls, forgetting his name. He couldn't separate what had actually happened from what his mind had manufactured. Dr. Warren explained to him that extreme stress, sensory deprivation, and physiological trauma can cause the brain to essentially malfunction, creating false memories and hallucinations that feel completely real. The psychological evaluation revealed several concerning findings. Matthew showed symptoms of severe PTSD, hypervigilance, nightmares, intrusive thoughts about the cave. He developed acute claustrophobia, panicking in any enclosed space, including his own bathroom. He couldn't tolerate darkness at all, sleeping with lights on and experiencing panic attacks if the lights went out. Most disturbingly, he showed signs of depersonalization disorder, periods where he didn't feel connected to his own body or identity, as if he were watching himself from outside. This was a direct result of those hours when he'd forgotten his own name, when his sense of self had dissolved in the darkness. Matthew was discharged on March 27th with referrals to multiple specialists, a psychiatrist for medication management, a therapist for trauma work, a neuropsychologist to assess any lasting cognitive damage. He moved back in with his parents in Texas because he couldn't be alone. The nightmares were too severe, the panic attacks too frequent. He'd wake up screaming that he was trapped, that the walls were closing in, that Danny was calling him back into the darkness. His mother would hold him while he sobbed, this 32-year-old man broken by 4 days in the dark. The investigation into how Matthew ended up in Labyrinth Cave uncovered a pattern of poor decision-making that had been building for years. Police found his caving logs and discovered he'd been solo caving regularly without telling anyone where he was going, often choosing difficult or unmapped systems, pushing his limits repeatedly. He'd gotten away with it dozens of times, which had reinforced his belief that he was invincible. The reports were published in caving safety journals as a case study. Experienced caver develops overconfidence, ignores basic safety protocols, suffers catastrophic consequences. The bones Matthew had found in the cave were identified through forensic analysis. They belonged to a caver named Thomas Mitchell, who'd gone missing in Labyrinth Cave in 1987, 33 years earlier. Thomas had also been solo caving, had also gotten lost, and had never been found until Matthew literally stumbled over his remains. The discovery brought closure to Thomas's family, but also served as a grim reminder that Labyrinth Cave had killed before and would likely kill again if people didn't respect its dangers. 6 months after the incident, Matthew sat in his therapist's office in Austin, Texas, working through yet another session on trauma processing. He'd made progress. The nightmares had decreased from every night to 2 or 3 times a week. He could shower with the door closed now, though he still couldn't use elevators or go into basements. He was working part-time from home. His cognitive functions mostly recovered, though his processing speed was slower than before. His therapist asked him a question she'd asked many times. "Do you understand now what went wrong?" Matthew nodded slowly. "I thought experience made me safe. I thought because I'd done it 80 times before I could do it again. I thought I was special, that bad things happened to other people but not to me. I was arrogant. I ignored every safety rule. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I went into an unmapped cave alone. I didn't bring adequate supplies. I didn't have backup plans. I did everything wrong, and I almost died because of it. His voice broke, and I lost something in that cave that I'll never get back. What did you lose? His therapist asked gently. Matthew thought about this. I lost my confidence. I lost my independence. I lost 4 days of my life that I'll never fully remember. I lost the ability to be alone without panicking. I lost the person I was before. He paused, tears running down his face. And I lost my brother, all over again. Danny wasn't really there in the cave. I know that logically. But it felt so real. He was helping me, guiding me. And then he was gone again, and I had to accept all over again that he's dead, and he's never coming back. The cave took everything from me. But his therapist pushed back gently. You didn't lose everything, Matthew. You're alive. You have your family. You have your mind. Even if it's damaged, you have the opportunity to tell your story and maybe prevent someone else from making the same mistakes. That's not nothing. Matthew considered this. He'd been asked to speak at a caving safety conference, to share his experience with other cavers. He'd been terrified of public speaking before all this, and now the idea of standing in front of a room full of people made him want to throw up. But maybe she was right. Maybe if his nightmare could save someone else, there was some meaning in it. Matthew did speak at the conference in September 2020. He stood at the podium, hands shaking, voice breaking, and told 200 cavers what had happened to him in Labyrinth Cave. He showed them photos of himself from before, healthy, confident, smiling. Then photos from after, gaunt, hollow-eyed, haunted. He described the hallucinations, the terror, the moment he forgot his own name. He described lying down next to those bones, ready to die, and the miracle of rescue arriving just in time. And then he said the words that would be quoted in caving safety materials for years to come. I was an experienced caver. I'd done 80 caves over 5 years. I thought I knew what I was doing. But experience without respect is just arrogance in disguise. The cave doesn't care about your resume. The cave doesn't care that you've done this before. The cave is patient and unforgiving, and it will kill you the first time you make a mistake. I survived through pure luck and the dedication of an incredible rescue team. Most people in my situation don't survive. Don't be like me. Tell someone where you're going. Bring redundant systems. Never cave alone. Respect the darkness. Because 4 days lost in a cave will change you in ways you can't imagine and can never undo. The speech went viral in the caving community. It was shared across forums, posted on cave rescue websites, shown in training courses. Matthew received hundreds of messages from cavers thanking him for his honesty and saying his story had made them reconsider their own practices. Several people admitted they'd been planning solo trips to difficult caves and had decided against it after hearing what Matthew went through. If his 4 days of hell could save even one life, Matthew thought, maybe he could live with the trauma. But living with the trauma was harder than he'd expected. 3 years after Labyrinth Cave, Matthew still had nightmares. He still panicked in small spaces. He still slept with lights on. He'd tried exposure therapy, going into progressively smaller spaces, trying to desensitize himself, but the claustrophobia remained. The therapist eventually told him it might be permanent, that his brain had been so profoundly traumatized by those 4 days that it would never fully recover the ability to feel safe in enclosed spaces. Matthew never caved again. He couldn't even look at photos of caves without feeling his chest tighten and his breathing become shallow. He sold all his caving equipment, donated it to a rescue training program. He found new hobbies, outdoor activities that involved open spaces and sunlight, hiking, kayaking, bird watching. Things where he could always see the sky, always see the horizon, always know exactly where he was and how to get home. The cognitive effects were subtle but persistent. Matthew's IQ tests showed he was still above average, but his working memory and processing speed had both decreased measurably. Tasks that used to be easy now required more effort and concentration. He couldn't multitask the way he used to. His job performance suffered, and eventually he had to take a position with fewer responsibilities and less stress. It was humbling and frustrating, this permanent reduction in his capabilities, this lasting cost of his 4 days in the dark. But perhaps the hardest part was the guilt. Matthew knew that dozens of people had risked their lives to save him. The rescue team had gone into a dangerous, confusing cave system to extract someone who'd made stupid decisions. Sheriff Tom Bradley, Dr. Alan Foster, Maria Santos, and her dog Ranger. All of them had put themselves at risk because of Matthew's mistakes. He'd written thank you letters to all of them, but words felt inadequate. How do you thank someone for saving your life when you're the reason your life needed saving in the first place? Rachel Kim, his ex-girlfriend who'd ultimately called the police and started the rescue, visited Matthew a year after the incident. They met for coffee, the same thing she'd suggested in that text he'd never answered. She looked at him across the table and said, "I'm glad you're alive. I'm sorry for what you went through, but I'm also angry at you for being so reckless. You almost died, Matthew. You almost died because you couldn't be bothered to send one text message." Matthew nodded, accepting her anger. He deserved it. "I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." They talked for 2 hours, clearing the air, finding a path back to friendship. It would never be what it was before, but it was something. The old backpack Matthew had found in the cave, the one with Thomas Mitchell's remains, haunted him more than anything else. He'd learned Thomas's story. 31 years old, solo caver, got lost in Labyrinth Cave in 1987. Thomas had survived maybe 3 or 4 days before dehydration and hypothermia killed him. His body hadn't been found for 33 years. Matthew thought about Thomas's family, the decades they'd spent not knowing what happened to him, hoping maybe he'd just run away, started a new life somewhere. The closure of finding his remains was bittersweet at best. Matthew visited Thomas's grave in 2021, placed flowers, and whispered an apology for disturbing his rest. If you're reading this story and thinking it could never happen to you, Matthew wants you to know that's exactly what he thought. He was experienced, he was careful, he was smart, and he still ended up spending 4 days slowly going insane in absolute darkness, forgetting his own name, hallucinating conversations with his dead brother. The cave doesn't care about your confidence. It doesn't care about your experience. It's just rock and water and darkness, patient and eternal. And if you give it the opportunity, it will kill you or break you, or both. The statistics are sobering. According to the National Speleological Society, there are approximately 30 to 50 caving deaths per year in the United States. Many of them are experienced cavers who make single mistakes that cascade into disasters. Solo caving accounts for a disproportionate number of these deaths because if something goes wrong, there's no one to help, no one to go for rescue, no one to even know you're in trouble. Matthew Turner survived, but he's one of the lucky ones. For every Matthew, there are several others who didn't make it out. 5 years after Labyrinth Cave, Matthew lives a quiet life in Austin. He works a job that's below his capabilities but doesn't stress his damaged cognitive functions. He sees his therapist twice a month. He takes medication for PTSD and anxiety. He's dating someone new, a woman who knows his history and accepts his limitations. He can't go into her basement, can't ride in elevators with her, needs lights on to sleep. She's patient with all of it. They talk about maybe getting married someday, starting a family. Normal life things that Matthew wasn't sure he'd ever have again. He still thinks about Labyrinth Cave almost every day. The memories are fading but never disappearing. He can't remember exactly what passages he took or which chambers he explored, but he remembers the feeling, the primal terror of being lost in darkness, the sensation of his mind fracturing, the moment he lay down ready to die. Those memories are burned into his neurons, permanent scars on his psyche. When people ask him about the experience, he usually gives a brief summary and changes the subject. The full story is too long, too dark, too personal to share casually. But every time he hears about another caver getting lost, another rescue operation, another death in a cave system, Matthew feels a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that it wasn't him this time. Guilt that he'd put rescue teams at risk. Grief for the people who didn't survive. And a desperate wish that people would learn from others' mistakes instead of having to make the mistakes themselves. Cave safety protocols exist for a reason. They're written in the blood and bones of cavers who ignored them and paid the price. Matthew's message is simple. Respect the cave. Tell someone where you're going. Bring redundant everything. Never cave alone. Because 4 days lost in Labyrinth Cave taught him that experience doesn't make you invincible. It just makes you overconfident. And overconfidence is how experienced cavers die. He's alive today by the slimmest of margins. Because Rachel decided to call the police. Because rescue dogs could track his scent through miles of confusing passages. Because Dr. Foster arrived in time to treat his hypothermia and dehydration. Without any one of those factors, Matthew Turner would be another set of bones in Labyrinth Cave, another name on the list of cavers who entered a cave and never came out. He knows how close he came. He lives with that knowledge every day, and he'll spend the rest of his life making sure others know it too. Labyrinth. Cave is still there, still open, still claiming victims occasionally. The entrance is now posted with multiple warning signs, but determined cavers still enter. Some make it out, others don't. The cave doesn't judge, it just is. Patient, waiting, eternal.